This is the evening news from Mayadeen, and in the headlines for tonight, a speech an unprecedented speech for American President Trump attacks the UN from its podium and sees no use for its presence. A call for continuing the genocidal war in Gaza, war in Ukraine, and also preparing for war in Venezuela. Iran uses a strategy of peaceful war. Trump sees that America is not only US number one militarily, politically, economically, and influence-wise. Is he referring or is he hinting at American influence diminishing after the rapprochement between China, Russia, and India? So, outside the known norms for speeches of the American president, Trump's fiery speech against most of the world in the UN except for Israel. He sent messages domestically in America and also externally. Did Trump want it to be the speech of the only decision maker in the world, or does it reflect to a crisis of Americans' hegemony diminishing? Is he starting to sense really that major competing powers reject American hegemony and that the world is witnessing the era of multipolarity, not the American golden era, as he says? If Trump strongly aspires to get a Nobel Peace Prize, the response came from his ally, French President, who said that he must first stop the war in Gaza. And here the question, has Trump toppled his slogan about ending wars by force, or peace by force, or surrender, like what is happening by supporting the genocide war in Gaza, threatening the Palestinians, describing Russia as a paper tiger? There was also sharp criticism of the UN, whereby Trump said that there's no use for its presence. Its attack came hours after the two-state conference and many countries recognizing the Palestinian state. So does this indicate the end or trying to preserve American hegemony? One who wants a Nobel Peace Prize dedicated part of his speech to threaten Venezuela and topple its regime, led by Maduro. Does this reflect a strategy to control the Western Hemisphere? And will Washington try to carry out coups and wars against the Latinos? Trump's threats also targeted Iran. He bragged that no one could destroy its nuclear program like America did. So is Trump trying to enshrine American hegemony in Western Asia? And what does it mean when he says he wants to go back to the background base in Afghanistan? Of course, Trump hasn't forgotten the historic image of the Chinese military parade and around 20 leaders, including the Russian, North Korean, and the Iranian, alongside the Chinese. And they are all against the American hegemony. And the question here, is it a speech reflecting a crisis of hegemony? I welcome my two guests from Cairo, Chief Editor of Al-Ahram newspaper, Mr. Khaled Dawood, and also from London, expert in international affairs, Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. Welcome to both guests. I'll start with Mr. Khaled. So we have a stormy speech which is described as rude by some Western media outlets and Western newspapers. CNN described it as bold, whereby others wouldn't have dared to say what Trump said. He went over the time. The speech continued for around 1 hour, and it went 15 minutes beyond the time given to the rest of the presidents. The main question, which maybe we'll pose in the introduction, to what extent does this speech represent a big shift for Washington, being the main sponsor of the international system, to one that threatens to undermine the system? Good evening, Ms. Wafa. Thank you for hosting me. Indeed, as you mentioned, the speech was sincere in many faces and regarding many places of the world where the US plays a decisive role. But I think that Trump mixed between the domestic political speeches which he gives in the conferences in the United States and between addressing the countries of the world from the podium of the UN. And we even saw that he criticized the previous American administration. This is considered to be very much a domestic issue. He attacked former President Joe Biden, described him as Sleepy Joe. All these things which we're used to hearing domestically, but at the foreign level, he also attacked the organization, which he knows well that it is incapable, as he said indeed, to carry out its role. However, because of the American obstruction, the American role and the American veto, which presents many conflicts in the world from being solved, as usual, he's one who likes showcasing what he likes, making statements, as you said, which no one else would make. But I think that this summit and this speech reflects the crisis of failure for the American president in implementing any of the promises he made simply during his election campaigns, and saying that in 24 hours he'd end the war in Ukraine and in Gaza, and he will solve the Iranian nuclear program crisis. What concerns him in these three important issues, which are the focus of the world, the situation has further deteriorated in Gaza. The number of Palestinian martyrs have increased, the level of suffering and the starvation. And regarding the war between Russia and Ukraine, practically he changed the U.S. policy 180 degrees. He hosted Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska, and he criticized the Ukrainians strongly. However, in the end, and now 8 months after coming to the White House, nothing has happened regarding the Ukrainian issue, and in Iran it ended up with a military confrontation. However, in the end, the world as well, the rest of the world, or the overwhelming majority of the world, it was clear President Donald Trump that he doesn't rule the world, and if the U.S. stands completely with and participates with Israel in the war crimes it's committing against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, the world rejects this approach and is taking a completely different path, a clear message rejecting these crimes committed by the Zionist entity. And there was a recognition of the Palestinian state by the Zionist allies, closest allies, including Britain, which practically gave the existential justifications for the Zionist entity via the Balfour Declaration, first of all, and the speech which was made by the French president and the Brazilian president. Not one president spoke from the UN podium who didn't call for ending the war in Gaza, and believes that regardless of the stance regarding the October 7 attacks, what the Zionist occupation army is doing goes beyond all the well-known laws of war, and it comes within the context of war crimes and crimes of genocide and starvation, which must be confronted. Mr. Khalid, you just referred to the main issue today, and this is what President Macron said. The first test now of President Trump regarding the Nobel Peace Prize and the talk about peace is to end the war in Gaza. But how do these American policies impact the war in Gaza with these countries that recognize the Palestinian state? They're being accused of giving Hamas a reward, and Netanyahu wants to respond to this international coordination after international recognition, after coordinating with the U.S. The answer is, let's be frank, the U.S., specifically the Trump administration, isn't a mediator, it's a partner in this war. And anyone who listens to Trump's speech yesterday, the U.S. always stands with the Zionist entity, but we were used to, at least in the discourse of the previous administrations, they would at least say that the Palestinians have a right to self-determination, to live in dignity. They have fundamental rights just like any other people in the world. Yesterday, President Trump spoke as if he is Israel's president, or as if he is the Israeli prime minister. And the same applies to his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and the new U.S. envoy to the United Nations, Mike Waltz. They speak the same language as the Zionist entity, and maybe Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, admitted for the first time that the U.S. approves of this operation to reoccupy Gaza City and displace the 1 million residents there. And he said the U.S. believes there's an opportunity to eliminate Hamas by this attack. And also the statements of the American envoy, or the American envoy to Lebanon, Tom Barak, when he said that peace is impossible and it's about deals. This is the problem. The current administration, and ever since Trump's arrival to the White House, they're focusing on one thing: to free the Israeli captives held by the Hamas movement, whereby they don't discuss in any whatsoever anything related to the Palestinian rights and Palestinian state. On the contrary, we heard once again from Trump and Rubio that there would be a reaction and punishment once again by the countries. This is what New York Times said, Mr. Khaled. Yes, and this is what New York Times detailed in which it described as false allegations. It listed Trump's lies in his speech to the UN and the insincerity of these claims, and it said that there were many misleading claims in this speech. And because you mentioned a main feature in Trump's speech, he isn't in agreement with the world. He's confrontational. He has an oppressive approach. Let me go to Mr. Papadopoulos, because this speech was very sharp. Do you agree with what the Guardian newspaper said, Mr. Papadopoulos, that there's an attack from the US, even on the UN podium and the Western allies? The Guardian says that this president wants to go to war with all those with him in that hall where he was giving the speech. To what extent do we have a speech which reflects a new phase in American foreign policy after accusing the United Nations?
The Guardian newspaper is a major propaganda outlet of the British establishment. No importance whatsoever should be attached to The Guardian. The Guardian is pro-war, pro-Israel, pro-Zionism, and anti-Russia and anti-Iran, and, quite frankly, anti-Palestine. So please do not quote the words of British mainstream media, because British mainstream media is neither free nor independent. It is controlled by the British establishment. It is not journalism, it is propaganda. Now, let me say this. The Arab world knows me as a friend to the Arab, as someone who wishes to see the Arab world free of the tyrannical, corrupt, pro-Western, pro-Israeli and treacherous governments which rule it. Now, in regard to Trump's speech, largely speaking, I agree with what he said. His speech was candid. He did not conceal his opinions. Yes, there were areas which I disagreed with. For example, claiming that he has negotiated peace settlements to various conflicts in the world, such as between the so-called Republic of Kosovo and Serbia. Well, there is no war between the so-called Republic of Kosovo and Serbia. However, his attacks on the United Nations are completely legitimate. Whilst the United Nations is a good idea, it is a complete and utter failure. What has the United Nations done to prevent genocide in Gaza? Nothing. What has the United Nations done to stop Israel from routinely violating Lebanon's independence and sovereignty? Nothing. That is a very important observation that Trump made. We never heard that from Biden, or from Obama, or from Bush Sr., or indeed from Clinton. We should welcome the brutal honesty that Trump displayed in his speech. Whether we agree with it or not, let people speak brutally honest. He also made reference to Iran. Now, let's be clear about it. Let us not discard what Iranian officials have said about their experiences in negotiating with representatives of the Trump administration. Those Iranian officials have said that their meetings with the Americans have been candid and have been respectful and have been effective. If Trump had not won the election last year in America, do you really believe that Kamala Harris, who was the candidate of the American deep state, would be talking with the Iranians? Of course she would not be. As I said, she was the candidate of the American deep state. And in regard to the American bombing of Iran and then Iran's attack on American military bases in the region, you don't need too many brain cells to realise that Washington and Tehran had orchestrated that between themselves in private. Trump and the Iranians needed each other to get out of a very dangerous situation which the Israelis had put them in. So when we hear about America's bombing of Iran and then Iran's bombing of American bases in the region, we can safely say that it was a complete act by both of them. I also want to say this, that your enemy, the enemy of the Arab people, the Western ruling elites, is...
Allow me, Mr. Papadopoulos, we can't overlook this. How can we say that it was orchestrated between the US and the Iranians when the bases are struck and the Iranian response was at this scale? And we know in the final days there was urging from the Israelis. The Israelis, after the big losses inflicted, after what the Israeli missiles achieved with their balance of power, which inflicted pain on the Israeli strategic locations or strategic sites were hit. So their main request was for America to intervene and then to end this war. Could you explain for me this point which you just mentioned?
I most certainly can explain that. When the Americans bombed the Iranian nuclear facility, how many Iranians died? 0. When the Iranians attacked the American military bases, how many American military personnel were killed or were injured? 0. Is that not telling? Does that not tell you that that the Americans and the Iranians had given each other prior warning of their intentions? Yes, the Americans are wholeheartedly with Israel, which I completely condemn. But Israel is America's main conduit for its influence and power in West Asia. Nonetheless, Trump has made it very clear that he wishes to talk with Iran. He has made it very clear that there is no reason as to why there can't be a rapprochement between Washington and Tehran. Indeed, Iranian officials have said exactly the same thing. The problem is that America comes under immense Israeli influence, and that extends to Trump. But still...
Yesterday we had a stance from Sayyid Ali Khamenei, the Iranian Supreme Leader. Mr. Papadopoulos, there's no use for dialogue with America. He put that option aside for the Iranians. Now, in light of with the ongoing talks and sanctions imposed from the Westerners, be it the European Troika or also the Americans. But when it comes to negotiating with the Americans, he says there's no use for negotiating with the Americans. How can you explain this?
What politicians say in public is most of the time for public consumption. So the Iranian leader has to talk strong in public in order to reassure the Iranian people that Iran will not back down, that Iran will not talk with its enemies. Trump does exactly the same thing. However, even to this day, and we know this as a fact, the Iranians and the Americans are continuing to talk with each other in private. Do not attach too much importance to what politicians say in public. It's what happens behind closed doors what counts. So again, the Americans and the Iranians are talking. They are talking to this day. Indeed, the Iranian foreign minister only said recently that even after the Americans bombed the nuclear facility in Iran, both sides were still talking with each other. Are we really going to discard what the Iranians are saying? Of course we shouldn't. So again, whatever Trump's shortcomings are, and principally I believe his shortcomings are when it comes to Israel, we should welcome the fact that he wants to talk with the Iranians. And in regard to Ukraine, I believe the Americans and the Russians have come to a private agreement with each other, which will allow Russia to emerge victorious in Ukraine and which will allow Trump to wash his hands of Ukraine. Trump has no interest in Ukraine whatsoever.
Now, on the other hand, the most recent stance from President Trump called for shooting down the Russian fighter jets. At many points now, we're joined by our guest from Washington. I welcome him, Mr. Robert Arlett, strategic expert in the Republican Party, joining us live from Washington. He has the right to respond to all these points, whether it be regarding the ties with Iran, the coordination which Mr. Papadopoulos referred to, and the secret agreement between the Russians and the Americans regarding the war in Ukraine. But let's go back to this extraordinary speech from President Trump in the UN, in an unfamiliar or unprecedented speech from American president from the UN podium. President Trump launched an attack on the organization. He says it's only satisfied with words instead of action, and there's no reason or no use for its existence. So Trump is saying it's too bad that I had to do things on behalf of the UN, and unfortunately it hasn't tried to help in any. I ended 7 wars, and I dealt with the leaders of each one of them, and I didn't receive even a phone call from the UN proposing or offering assistance. The only thing I got from the UN was a electric ladder which stopped in the middle when I was going up. The words of UN are still stronger than the actions. Only empty words, and empty words don't end wars. The only thing which will allow this is action. The UN has huge capabilities. I've always said this. Trump also referred to his achievements after 8 months being in power, saying that the US has retrieved its position as the greatest country in the world and is living its golden era. So he said, in recent years, my country suffered from deep crises, but today, after 8 months only after me taking power, we returned to greatness in the world, and there is no country that is close to our position. America has the strongest economy, strongest border, strongest army, the strongest friendships, and the strongest soul between all countries of the world. This is the American golden era. Mr. Arlett, I want to ask about America's greatness. To what extent are we indeed witnessing a greatness for this superpower in the world, or is the United States determined today, given the indicators he made and also Trump's fails, is there intent to destroy everything the international community believes in? Is he the only decision maker in the world, or does this speech reflect the retreat of the superpower and the emergence of competitors to the US on the international arena?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be with you and your audience. It is always a pleasure. And I would just say, President Trump does not mix words. He often speaks exactly his mind without a filter and often without a teleprompter. As we all know, of course, the teleprompter was not working briefly there while he was speaking at the General Assembly in New York. And I think at the end of the day, President Trump means exactly what he says. I do believe that the policies that he has instituted and he has followed through are just that. It's just safeguard our own borders. It's to grow our economy. And ultimately, President Trump has always ran on when he was running for president and continues to seek peace and end conflicts and bloodshed around the world. Yes, he is accurate as he states that UN can do more and they should do more. And I don't disagree with him as it relates to what are they doing and really what purpose purpose do they serve other than just words and collecting money from a lot of countries around the world as a funding of their budget? So I think UN can do more, and they should do more, and therefore they need to do more to, again, stop conflicts. They need to be more mediators. They need to continue their diplomacy efforts and have results beyond just words. So it's hard to disagree with President Trump, because what has UN actually done? And I would say I was also listening to my friend, my colleague, if you would, speaking about how U.S. and Iran are working with each other behind the scenes and perhaps under the radar in secrecy. I would say, what evidence exists? I come from a military intelligence background, and I would say, what evidence exists? Just because no one was killed, I think what that does show is that President Trump was precise and focused on destroying their nuclear capabilities, right, and not going after any individuals and murdering, if you would, individuals. And make no mistake, Iran did launch bombs targeting people, personnel, in Qatar, in Doha. So we have to remember that it was only our defense missiles that prevented those missiles from actually landing and actually killing people. So I would say that unless you have evidence, I'm not so sure that's an accurate statement. But with that being said, are there always conversations happening behind scenes and not in front of the camera? Absolutely. And President Trump has always stated he would love for Iran to turn their page and focus on a new path forward, other than constantly supporting terrorism and bloodshed around the world. So President Trump said that when he was in the Middle East several months ago. He offered a lifeline, a new path forward for Iranians, the people of Iran. And I think that is an ongoing conversation that President Trump would love to see. And I think many in the Middle East also would love to see Iran change their ways and focus more on serving their people and stopping up the bloodshed around the world.
But Mr. Arlott, regarding President Donald Trump, he presents himself as a peacemaker, but at the same time, this slogan fails or collapses when he supports these like genocide and continuing to give a green light for the Israelis in the Gaza Strip, and also continuing to support the Ukrainians.
I think President Trump is accurate, because there is complete evidence of him actually stopping and preventing further conflict and bloodshed throughout various conflicts. And he's actually accurate in the examples he's provided. I think it was 6 or 7 different ones. And you can't take that away from him. It was absolutely because of him intervening those leaders and those conflicts and stop them. Yes, there's a lot more work to be done between Russia and Ukraine, and of course Israel and.
If you allow me, Mr. Arlott, the other opinion, the opposing opinion, says that the evidence he gave, the 7 wars he referred to, reflected to sleeping conflicts, limited wars, like, for example, Ukraine, or like Palestine, and what Israel is doing to the people of Gaza, and also in the occupied West Bank, and even in the region, Lebanon, Yemen, and Syria.
And I think what that means is that those rumors came about when President Trump was not president. I agree with you. But at the same time, while he has been president, he's eliminated or prevented further conflict in those other 7 examples that were given. And yes, I think he's absolutely frustrated with all of the various leaders in these 2 wars, because the wars continue and the bloodshed continues. So I think he is willing to do what it will take to end these wars. But I think the 2 conflicts, the 2 wars, are absolutely a level of frustration for him. And I have said on your network and on many others that President Trump can and needs to do more in a public outcry and a pushback of Benjamin Netanyahu of the ongoing murdering of the civilian Palestinians. So I think he needs to do more, and I'd like to think that he will continue to do more behind the scenes, but also he needs to do more, I think, publicly, specifically about that war between Israel and the Palestinian people and Hamas. And I'd like to see him do more. But at the end of the day, let's not forget, these wars were already in place when he became president for the 2nd time, and so he has to undo the wrong, if you would, that was there with President Biden, and that's not an easy task. So I think more can be done, but I believe in the end that while he is president, I'd like to think that these wars will come to an end, and President Trump will achieve peace between these the various two countries and these two wars, because I believe this. You know why? It's because President Trump cares about his legacy, and he wants to be known as the presidency of peace and prosperity. So for that reason, I am highly confident that these wars will end while President Trump is in office.
What do you think, Mr. Khalid Dawood? Is a Trump strategy indeed peace by wars? And does this speech, this escalatory, fiery, different kind of speech, which goes against all of the norms, does this reflect real concerns and fears that worry the Americans, worry the great America, after decades worry that this hegemony is declining in favor of competitive players confronting the US today? The answer is, first of all, let me clarify that the American President Donald Trump, the American right wing reject the international organizations and the UN. One of the things which was very change in Trump's criticism to the UN is that there was no measure which he didn't spare, like for example his stance to the International Court of Justice after it issued a verdict calling on Israel to end the genocidal war in Gaza, or imposing sanctions on the judges of the International Criminal Court, and also rejecting the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas from participating in the UN General Assembly. Of course, above all this, using the veto 14 times over the past 2 years. At least between 13 or 14 Security Council countries. So President Trump specifically, and even before him, even George W. Bush, when he unilaterally went ahead and invaded, occupied Iraq, they want the coalition, what they call the coalition of the willing, coalition of democracy, which is in sync with the American goals. One of the reasons behind this sharp attack by President Trump on the International Organization of the UN is, of course, because of their stance. 153 countries out of 190 or 193 countries now recognizing the Palestinian state. At the time where the American president rejects this measure and describes the European countries as being disloyal and having little value and only ink on paper, and America only will take up or is able to determine the outcome of all of these conflicts. So it was very strange to hear from the American president an attack on an organization which is a governmental one. I worked as a correspondent for them in the UN for 6 years, and what always the moves the UN into action is the government. If the America were to take a positive stance regarding any international conflict, and the other countries go along, it ends. So does this show, Mr. Khalid, does this speech, is it part of restructuring the international system from the current American administration's perspective? The answer is, of course, Ms. Wafa, this man who raises a slogan, America First, who spoke very arrogantly. And I'd just like to refer to the person, to the gentleman, Mr. Arlett from the US. I think that Trump's claim that he ended 6 or 7 conflicts, he included, as an Egyptian, he included Egypt and Ethiopia. And actually, there was no war between us and Ethiopia. And the conflict between us and Ethiopia hasn't ended. There's a technical glitch, it appears. So the world knows that what he says is not true. What he wants only is a world led by the US. And this is no longer possible because, on the other hand, even the electoral base, Mr. Wafa, of Donald Trump, the so-called MAGA movement, Make America Great Again, they don't want the US to get involved in any foreign wars. And this might be the reason behind the fact that President Donald Trump only wanted to deliver a only wanted the war, they want to continue to have 12 days, targeting certain sites and carrying out this, of course, in coordination, a joint operation with a Zionist entity and the Israeli army. But, of course, they don't even want the American president to get involved in defending, if it were required to defend Israel itself when it comes to getting involved in foreign wars. But this does not mean, but it was interesting, Mr. Khalid, this fiery speech which he directed to the Allies first and foremost, and I refer this to Mr. Papadopoulos. This speech was sharp, selective. It featured animosity towards European leaders, especially after the recognition of the Palestinian state. He accused them of destroying their countries because of the policies which they pursue regarding immigration, green energy, and he said that these policies are in order to incite the mega feelings against the European liberalists. To what extent is he witnessing or sensing the rise of other powers? This is what we also read today, that Trump's speech in the UN underscores the necessity to form strong alliances to confront him. And so from here, these forces, the European countries, the EU, could take a different policy, different from the other policies, and not be under the American umbrella or the American domination. To what extent would this be realistic, Mr. Papadopoulos?
Trump hates the Western ruling elites, and the Western ruling elites hate Trump. When I say the Western ruling elites, I am referring to the dark, malignant forces which rule, not govern, rule the Western world. And in particular, I am talking about the American deep state and the British deep state. That is the reason why I support Trump. I will always condemn Trump for his pro-Israel stance. However, he highlighted, as he has on numerous occasions before, the horrific consequences for Western nations of immigration. He has highlighted the scam that is climate change. The Arab people and the British people and the American people have a common enemy, the Western ruling elites. And in America today, Trump is not fully in charge. There is a struggle for power between Trump and the American deep state. So when he attacks and humiliates the likes of Starmer, that is Trump attacking the British ruling elite or the British deep state, because Starmer is the chief puppet of the British deep state. You ask about America's future in the world. America is a superpower. Russia is also a superpower, but America is the overall dominant superpower, politically, economically, and militarily. America will remain a superpower for the foreseeable future. However, there are other major powers emerging in the world, such as China. But the Chinese military cannot compare to the American military. The only power in the world which can literally destroy the United States of America is, of course, Russia. Russia is a military superpower. Russia is a nuclear superpower. Russia is the most powerful and the largest nuclear power in the world. People do not understand that the reason why the Russian military campaign is moving at a slow pace is because the Russians do not wish to kill civilians in Ukraine, because they regard the people in Ukraine, apart from in eastern Galicia and Volyn, they regard the people in Ukraine as part of the Russian world. Also, NATO has saturated Ukraine with hardware. So it is inevitable that the Russian military campaign will take time. But the Russians have been winning from day one. Well over 1.5 million Ukrainian soldiers have been killed or wounded. Nowhere near that amount have the Russians incurred in Ukraine. So America will remain the most powerful country in the world. Some people talk about the BRICS. Well, again, that's a farcical argument. The BRICS includes countries which do not like each other, such as China and India. And the Chinese and the American economies are interlocked, they are interdependent. Then we have some people saying that India is a future superpower. That is absolutely ludicrous. Yes, India has achieved a lot, but India will never be a superpower. And I just want to reiterate, Trump made a brutally candid speech at the United Nations. Good. We should welcome that. Or do we really want to hear the drivel that we used to hear from the likes of Biden, Obama, Blair, Cameron and Johnson? People who care nothing for their countries, people who care nothing for peace in the world.
So I can understand from what you're saying, Mr. Papadopoulos, that you very much like. I don't know the boldness of Trump in this speech, and it differs from the other American leaders and presidents, bearing in mind that there were also messages to America domestically were lastest, Mr. Arlett. But before, let's go to a report to deepen this, Mr. Papadopoulos. Many analysts believe that Trump's policy, even towards the allies, towards the Europeans, are an attempt which might succeed today in delaying the end of the international order in light of these alliances, which you say aren't at the level of confronting the US, bearing in mind that we have two organizations, Shanghai Cooperation Council and BRICS, and today there's a clear confrontation at many levels. Let's take, for example, the economy with the Americans. Mr. Papadopoulos, question to you.
As I said, the Chinese and American economies are interdependent. If that connection, economic connection between America and China was to be severed, then that would have disastrous consequences for the American economy and in particular the Chinese economy. Therefore, China will always afford priority to its economic and trade relationship with America over everything else in the world, including the BRICS. The Chinese economic miracle is overwhelmingly based on its trade and investment relationship with America, which started under Deng Xiaoping. So under no circumstances will the Chinese take any decision which could jeopardize their economic relationship with America. Yes, the Chinese in public will talk strong about America, and at the same time, Trump in public will talk strong about China. But again, behind closed doors, the situation is very different. So as I said moments ago, in regard to the BRICS, we have, for example, China as a member. We also have Vietnam. Well, China and Vietnam are bitter enemies with each other. I am not rejecting the BRICS. I believe that the BRICS serves a purpose for its members. It helps economically. It provides a great deal of bilateral relations between the members. But no one can seriously argue that the BRICS is going to challenge America because there is no economic unity between the BRICS. Again, take India's economic relationship with America. The Indian economy would be in dire trouble if its relationship with America was to end overnight. So we need to be level-headed. Yes, America has weakened. That is largely a result of Russia having become a superpower again. But it is delusional to argue that America is about to collapse.
So there was no real threat, according responding to this approach, Mr. Papadopoulos, about ending this American hegemony and reaching a multilateral order. But let's get the point of view of the guests, especially this speech included many messages. And when we talk about the strategy of ongoing wars, there were direct messages from President Trump to a number of fronts, whether it be the threats to West Asia, when he expressed pride about targeting the Iranian nuclear program, when he spoke about wars the US could wage with the Latin neighbor trying to topple the Maduro regime in Venezuela, and also wars on countries in the, or considered to be left wing. Let's take a look at the report, which will deepen between the lines of Trump's speech. A lot can be said. We could start with the escalator, which doesn't work. So let's take a listen. The history, or the American history, started on June 4, 1967, or 1776. So from here, Trump, the American president, gave his speech in the UN, calling on everyone to take part with him in building what he called the globe of peace. However, what he said in the speech showed that he lives alone in this Trump globe. The bombing or bombardment to more than one party. First of all, the person responsible for the escalators even promised him that he would be in trouble. And also the attack against the international organization continued. The escalator doesn't work, wasting the public money and corruption, and most important of all, Trump says, I ended 7 wars, and the UN even didn't try to help me in any of them. However, wait a second, Trump counted these wars: Cambodia, Thailand, Kosovo, Serbia, Rwanda, Pakistan, India, Israel, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. Each one of them, or not all of them, were wars, as much as there were conflict zones which were up from time to time. A large segment of Trump's speech referred to the American domestic situation as if directed to his own supporters. In an election occasion in the first term, he said he built the greatest economy in the history of the world. We're quickly recovering from the economic crisis we inherited from the Joe Biden administration, the most corrupt and incompetent administration in history. Barack Obama waged war on the carbon emissions and practiced it in the world. Washington, which was the capital of crime in America, is no longer that. Trump's, this is what he said, and other American domestic issues which have nothing to do with the UN podium. And the other issues in the others, no achievement but rather orders. The war in Gaza must stop, the hostages must be handed over immediately, climate change must be ignored because it's the biggest act of deceit in the world, and others to prove Trump was right in everything according to what he said. It's the American golden era. Trump is turning off the lights in his globe without forgetting that he deserves a Nobel Peace Prize for all these achievements. So that was a report. Mr. Arlett, my question is a two-part question, and if possible, a brief answer. First of all, why these messages domestically? Because there's ongoing insistence to talk about the domestic policies, domestic achievements, despite the fact he's speaking to an international audience, international leaders, even referring to previous American presidents. What the significance of this from the UN podium? Second of all, if President Trump aspires for a Nobel Peace Prize, why does he dedicate a major part to talk about wars which the US might initiate or ignite by threatening Venezuela, toppling the regime led by Maduro, even organizing coups in Latin American countries, even regarding West Asia, America wanting to return to Afghanistan?
I think it's a great question. I would say we all know President Trump is a marketer, and he is, and you know, he promotes America. That's what he does. He promotes his own brand when he was a businessman, and today he is president of the United States. So therefore, he is promoting his brand, which is America. Is it appropriate for him to speak of domestic policies at the UN? I don't know. pursuit of similar policies as he has instituted here in America. So I think he's giving America as an example for others to follow, which is exactly why he did that. As far as to your other point, I think that and read your question, if you would. Ask that second question, if you would. I want to get it right. If you could ask that second question again for me, please.
Yes, when we speak about igniting new fronts for the Americans, the attempts to topple regimes in Latin America, threatening them, as well as also expanding wars in West Asia, bragging about targeting Iran once again, or even the new American invasion of the Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan.
Something specific about El Salvador is quite simply, it's all about the drugs. It's all about the drugs that are coming into America from that very country. And so therefore, President Trump is putting them on notice. You will no longer continue to do what you've done in the past. And that is kill Americans. And again, that's exactly what he said. Well, and as far as the conflict specific with Iran, well, I would say that was a proactive, preemptive effort to eliminate their nuclear capabilities. So sometimes you have to be proactive because I think many leaders around the world, well, I guess one could say that they have been a renegade of sorts and could do what they want by law country, and we are law authority, and that he is a president of peace and a president of prosperity, and he is going to do just that. He's going to ensure a short-term skirmish, if you would, i.e. bombing of nuclear weaponry in Iran specifically, to prevent a much bigger problem, and that is them actually launching missiles in the Middle East and perhaps even beyond into Europe. So I think it's all about proactiveness and all about preemptiveness and ensuring that peace and prosperity remains and continues throughout the region and throughout the world.
I'll conclude with you, Mr. Khalid Dawood. The attempts to ignite and keep these wars in all of these fronts, does this indicate the continuation of the American hegemony and this American golden era, Trump says, or is the world indeed witnessing today a phase which could take us to an era of multipolarism and a new world order? The answer is yes. Unfortunately, Mr. Rafa, I disagree completely with the speaker from the US regarding what the American president administration went about establishing or spreading peace. Actually, during the next 3 or more years, I don't think we're going to witness stability or ending any of the wars, as long as the American president's main concern is showcasing or theatrics, showing himself to be a strong president, and he's proven over the past few months that he's a paper tiger. He wasn't able to solve any of the main conflicts. On the contrary, he's causing more conflicts, and him continuing this way, especially regarding our region here in the Middle East, this will only lead to more chaos and more wars, and specifically with completely siding with the Israeli entity and supporting the displacement and annexing the West Bank to the Zionist entity. So all of these policies don't indicate that we're coming close to any kind of stability in the region or in the world. And the fear is that this will continue after the end of the term in 3 or a bit more months. And I think this is what some of the world leaders are putting their hopes on, be the Chinese or Russians or Indians, who know that American policies don't necessarily change with a change of presidents, but they can deal with a person who seems to be easier or doesn't take things so personally. He also said that he didn't get a contract with the UN, as if this is one of the reasons which led to him having a personal problem with the UN, and he has enough of domestic problems which could obstruct him foreignly, like we see, for example, the killing of the famous influencer Charles Kirk, or his relationship with the millionaire who was killed, Jeffrey Epstein. So these are all issues which maybe the American president focuses on more than spreading peace in the world. Thank you very much, Mr. Khalid Dawood, Chief Editor of the Ahram Weekly. Thank you very much also, to Mr. Robert Arlett, who was a strategic expert in the Republican Party from Washington, and also Mr. Marcus Papadopoulos, expert in international affairs, joining us from London.